we're gonna wait until 9:02, and then we'll go ahead and get started. But thank you very much. So take just a few minutes to get your coffee warmed up, and we'll get started in about 2 minutes. Oh, we've got a lot of people jumping on. That's fantastic. So excellent. What are we at so far, Vicki?
23.
Wonderful. Wonderful. And you, all you guys that are going to be listening today, you are welcome to leave your cameras on. I love seeing your little smiling faces. It keeps me focused, so it does help. Um, we've got about 1 more minute left, and then we'll get started. I'm going to make sure everybody has enough time to get jumped on here. It is cold and overcast and rainy here, and I'm super grateful that I have really good hot coffee. Okay, we'll get started in just a minute. We've got probably about 30 seconds left. As soon as that time hits 9:02, we'll go ahead and get started, and see if we can teach you a few new things today. All right, 9:02. So let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all for taking time out of your schedules today. I know trying to get an hour or a little more than an hour out in the beginning of a day is really tough, and I really appreciate all of you taking the time to be here. So this is 2026 Strategies for Science Safety. And as I'm looking at the front page of this, I should have changed that to school chemical safety. So, because this is not just focused on science, and we'll actually talk about that this morning. So let's go ahead and get started. So first of all, I'm Becky Anderson. It's wonderful to be with you today. I appreciate the opportunity to share some of the things that I found over the last, I don't know, 25 years that I've been doing this. So I own a small environmental consulting firm in just south of Des Moines, Iowa, and I've been a consultant for about 18 years. Prior to that, I started my career as a bench chemist for a very large corporate chemical company. I worked for the Iowa Department of Natural Resources for a couple of years, and then I spent about 10 years as a regulatory compliance hazmat chemist for Metro Waste Authority, which is the largest solid waste agency in Iowa. During that time, I also became a volunteer firefighter and an EMT. And so I worked a lot with our local emergency response community, and we had just some wonderful partnerships that occurred over those years. And then about 18 years ago, I decided, you know what, I want to kind of go out on my own and see if I can actually run a business. And frankly, for a chemist and a hazmat chemist, running a business has been kind of a crazy challenge. I should have probably taken some business classes, but we want to go ahead and get started. And I want to just take a minute to thank Vicki Davis out at Upper Valley Lake Sunapee Regional Planning Commission. That's just a mouthful. So we're just going to say RPC, Regional Planning Commission. Vicki is in New Hampshire and has been an absolutely wonderful resource to obtain EP or these USDA grants and EPA grants so that we can produce these webinars and help share this information with folks throughout the country. These webinars are being recorded. So if you decide that maybe there are some colleagues that would benefit from this, please reach out to Vicki and we will get you links to the recorded webinars. We also have a series of webinars that we did a year ago, and those are also available. I want to take just a second and give a little tribute to Dave Waddell. Dave Waddell is kind of he was the leading force behind a nationwide Rehab the Lab program. Was wonderful, and we lost him about a year and a half ago. And there are still days that uh, that I really wish I could pick up the phone and call him and go, "You won't believe what I saw today, Dave," and pick through his amazing brain to help resolve the concerns that we're seeing in schools and that we continue to see. The goals of these webinars, and they'll be held over the next few months. Previous webinars really focused on reducing risk, what you should keep in your classrooms to use, what should be in the schools, and then what you should really think strongly about eliminating from your usage based on EPA regulations, OSHA regulations, and just general best practices for safety in the classroom. This series is a little bit different. We're going to focus on the regulatory requirements, and I will tell you, drafting these webinars has been a challenge because our regulations differ from state to state. We also see some differences from district to district. And ultimately, we have to meet or exceed the federal regulations. And we have some states that operate directly under the federal regulations. Other states they operate under the federal regulations, but they've also added in additional regulations. So it's really, really tough. And what I want to convey to you, especially you school folks, is why this is such a challenge for schools to get their arms around. We're going to spend some time, we're going to still talk about risk mitigation and what you should really consider not having in your school to use. We're going to spend quite a bit of time on understanding what the different components of a chemical hygiene plan are. And I've got some good information about, beneficial templates, the structure within a district and within a school. We'll talk through those things. We'll work through some standard operating procedures based on either regulatory requirements or standards or best practices. And then ultimately, though, the goal here is to help you find some cost-effective, common sense strategies to meet these complicated compliance requirements. Okay, so hang with me on that. It's not exactly the most exciting. Regulatory compliance is kind of tough. It's tough to spice up, but we'll do it as best we can. This is just kind of some tips for the webinar controls. Vicki is our host today. We do allow the participants to go ahead and ask questions if you want to use the chat box. We did have some questions that came in from the initial enrollment, and I'll try to answer those at the end of the presentation today. The presentation is designed to last somewhere between an hour and 15 minutes, and then I've left us another 15 minutes or so for question and answer. Also, you'll see that my email and my phone number are at the end of the presentation, and you're welcome to reach out. I prefer email. It's a little easier for me to manage, but I absolutely will respond to your email questions. So today's webinar overview, we really want to just kind of set the groundwork for where we're going to be going for the next 9 months or so. We want to talk about legacy chemicals. I was under the impression that we were really making a dent and minimizing legacy chemicals. And then I ended up at an adventure with a fairly local high school just last week that definitely involved legacy chemicals. So we'll talk about what those are, how to know if you have those in your facility, and then why these regulations are so tough for schools to get their arms around. Schools and districts as a whole face some unique challenges that are different than we see in industry. In my consulting work, I spend a lot of time in industry still. But I also do quite a bit of work with school districts, and the philosophy is just a little bit different in how different enough that it makes it more challenging. We're going to identify the high risk legacy chemicals. I'm going to give you kind of a reminder. This is a lot of repetition from the couple of the webinars from last year, but I wanted to make sure that for the folks that are new with us, that we emphasized why we don't just go into a chemical stock room, start pulling stuff off the shelf, stick it in boxes and send it away. Unfortunately, it's just not that easy. We're going to talk about the acronym that I really like for lab safety. And this came from American Chemical Society a few years ago. They have exceptional resources for schools on their website. And the acronym is RAMP: recognize, assess, minimize, and prepare. And I think that just fits perfectly with what all of the goals are for all of these webinars on mitigating risk in schools. We're going to tackle this stuff during this webinar, and during each webinar, we'll use a similar format. We'll end with 5 take-home items that you can begin to work on before the next webinar. We'll end with some question and answer time. And then we're also going to start, and this is a little bit new this time, we're going to start with what we call a demonstration of competency, and we're going to end with that as well. So OSHA has been pushing for the last several years that in addition to following the regulations, having the plans in place, OSHA really wants what they call a demonstration of competency. Do employees that are covered under OSHA or various other OSHA state agencies, do those employees actually understand what the content is when we're doing either webinars or online learning, or even in-person learning? So it's just something that I've kind of adapted and brought into a lot of the training presentations that I do. I use demonstration of competency when I teach DOT, hazardous materials general awareness, when I teach HAZWOPER. So all of these different presentations will have this. And it's just a couple of simple quiz questions. I use the same questions at the beginning that I do at the end. It kind of allows me to make sure that we stay on task and make sure that I'm teaching you new and interesting I'm teaching you new information. We'll just go with that today. So we're going to start with this. So for our demonstration of competency, these are 3 questions that just will help me gauge what your experience and education level is regarding legacy chemicals and chemical risk in schools. So the first question, and you can just jot these down in a note. These are true, false. So it's pretty easy for you to manage. So jot yourself a little note. Like question number 1 is legacy chemicals, true or false? Legacy chemicals are rarely found in school. Okay. Question number 2, hazardous chemicals are not only found in science rooms, are only found in science rooms. Excuse me, I kind of botched that one, didn't I? Are hazardous chemicals only found in science rooms? True or false? Question number 3, true or false? OSHA is the only agency that regulates hazardous chemical management. True or false? Okay. Is it just OSHA that you guys operate under, or are there a whole slew of regulators that are helping us stay safe? So let's start off with legacy chemicals. So the legacy chemicals that we see in schools, a lot of people question, really, are they this old? Are they really that big of an issue? And does this really happen a lot in most schools? And I'm going to tell you, I continue to see them. Legacy chemicals started in becoming a problem or being recognized, I would say in the 90s to early 2000s. And the origin of legacy chemicals comes from a period in the United States where science was really being emphasized in the curriculum. So in the 1940s, the United States and the Soviet Union were in a heated space race, and the US was behind. The Soviets launched Sputnik. And as a result of that, the US kind of really got concerned and started building robust science programs, and they encouraged nationwide research. And as a result of this, what we have seen is just an enormous number of chemicals from the 1940s, 50s, and 60s that remain in schools today. So resulting from this big push in science, we have historical documents that show that catalogs were sent to K-12 schools, colleges, and universities, and they were encouraged to order pretty much anything that they needed or thought they may need and keep it on their shelves just in case. And what we see is schools really stocked up during that time, and we continue to see those chemicals on shelves. And now they've been sitting for 60 to 80 years. The containers are broken down and leaking. They are frequently contaminated on the exterior, and some of them have degraded to the point that they become shock and friction sensitive, photosensitive. And we have found several over the years that are what we consider not DOT shippable. They've become unstable to the point, either through peroxidation or degradation, that they are not safe to put on the roadways with a hazardous waste disposal company. Talk about some head scratchers. These are some things that you can look for. And this is the best way to figure out if you've got legacy chemicals this is mostly science chemicals. Most of the legacy chemicals that we see are from Ward or Mallinckrodt. These Mallinckrodt labels, we worked with the manufacturers on, and if the container that you're looking at has a Mallinckrodt label and it's a hexagon with that block lettering, that label has not been used by a manufacturer since the 1960s. Now, if we look at the Mallinckrodt label that is in a script font, that one hasn't been used. That particular label style has not been used since the 1950s. So we're now pushing, 76 years old for these containers. And I will tell you, you're looking at a hydrofluoric acid container right there from the 1950s. After 76 years, that plastic container gets very brittle. The hydrofluoric acid stays as aggressive and strong and dangerous as ever, and really presents us with risk even to just pick up and move those chemicals. If you have chemicals in your collection where you have corks on the top or you have the little paper hat lids, those are an indication that we're dealing with chemicals that are even older, 1920s, 30s, and into the 40s. This Welch label hasn't been used since about 1940. So those are just some tips as you go through. And when you go back to your, for our science teachers in particular, when you go back to your stock rooms today and you're thinking about this and you're looking at those labels, please, I cannot emphasize this enough. Please do not just start moving bottles and containers around. You really need to do some research, some education, watch last year's webinars to learn what to look for that could potentially be shock sensitive or friction sensitive. We have found a number of chemicals that we don't want to move. They're highly, highly dangerous. And we'll talk more about that. Now, Rehab the Lab is kind of the label or the title that we've given all of these programs. And that's based on work that Dave Waddell did. And initially, I think there were a number of us working on this in the early 2000s. We were getting requests from science teachers for help. How do we get rid of these chemicals? We're nervous to walk into our own chemical stock rooms. I've had numerous teachers that have said, I keep my chemicals in the stock room on the very first shelf, and I just don't go any further back into the room because it's too scary. And we were getting calls, and I know in Iowa, I received several calls. We ran a small pilot project to start identifying whether or not, how big of a problem was this? Was this just one or two schools? And then there were a group of us that met at a North American Hazardous Materials Managers Conference. If you're not familiar with NAMA, I would encourage you to look into it. It's an exceptional organization. Dave Waddell led a seminar in the early 2000s. It was in Boston, and we all met in a room and started talking about this and figured out and determined that, wow, this is an enormous nationwide issue. And we've really got to work together to figure out some solutions for this because it's expensive. The regulatory compliance burden is very, very high. And our teachers just don't know what to do. Our administrators don't know what to do. So I took the information back to Iowa. and worked on building a network of resources. And to date in Iowa, we've removed more than 500,000 pounds of legacy chemicals, chemicals that were acutely toxic, chemicals that were radioactive, and unsecured. A whole variety of very dangerous chemicals have been removed since the early 2000s. We also, at that point in time, decided that it was really critical for us to put together some education so that teachers didn't just walk back into their stockrooms, start moving things around and boxing things up. And we had about 95% of districts in Iowa participate. And again, this was almost 20 years now. This has been almost 20 years ago. We had about 5,000, more than that, teachers that were educated over the years. And what we found, again, as we compared notes with the NAMA team, is that this was nationwide. Each state took a little bit different approach in how we did cleanup. King County, Washington has a very strong tax base. That's where Seattle is. They have a very strong tax base, so they had well-funded programs. In Iowa, we ran the shoe straight version. We do not have well-funded programs. And it was basically a group of folks that got together and decided this was a problem that we needed to help resolve. We are still continuing to see legacy chemicals, and we have states that have never conducted legacy chemical cleanouts. Now, the consequences of just leaving these stockpiles is pretty significant. Again, we see unstable containers can't be shipped because they're too unstable, too dangerous. Leaking, broken containers, very brittle plastic and glass. Even the silicates in some of the old 4-liter glass containers with the rings on them can become very compromised. Several years ago, we had a teacher that was working to remove some concentrated ammonium hydroxide in her science lab. She picked up that bottle and the bottom fell out of that container. And we see that not frequently, thank goodness, but we do see it. The kind of the icing on the cake, and that's probably a really terrible way to put it, but kind of the paradigm incident that led to involvement of EMC Insurance in Iowa, which was at that time the sole provider for property and casualty insurance for school districts, was a fire that occurred in 2006 in Andale, Kansas. Teachers they were getting ready to move into a new high school, and the teachers boxed up chemicals from the science room. They were mixed together. They weren't sorted by chemical class. There were legacy chemicals present. Nobody evaluated for instability or cross reactions. And those boxes ended up catching on fire and causing about $600,000 damage to that old school. Luckily, no one was hurt, but it was a really dangerous situation because, as you can imagine, this is an entire stockroom full of chemicals that lit itself on fire. In addition to that, we have seen incidents across the United States, and over the years, the Chemical Safety Board, who was really designed to address chemical accidents in industry, has also conducted investigations, and they've created some phenomenal learning videos. So if you have the opportunity, I would encourage you to check out the Chemical Safety Board education videos. I use them a lot in my training, and they're outstanding. They've done several white paper analyses on chemical accidents that have happened in schools, and they've provided some exceptional guidance on how we've solved this problem. I thought we were making really good progress. And then last week, I got a phone call from a high school locally. The security and risk manager for the district called me, and he said, I just got an email from one of my maintenance facilities people. He said our science teachers decided to take it upon themselves to clean out a bunch of stuff, and they put it in boxes. This is the picture of the initial review of the boxes. They double stacked the boxes, took them down to the facilities room, and put a note on top that says, "This is a work order, please dispose of these chemicals." Luckily, fortunately, the maintenance guy recognized that this was beyond his scope of knowledge and could probably be very dangerous. Serendipitously, I had been asked to come and speak to their district safety committee later in the afternoon. So he calls me in the morning, sends me an email, says, we've got this problem going on. I said, okay, how about if I come up a couple hours earlier and we do an evaluation of what's in those boxes? Because this is how Andale caught on fire. And we've got to make sure that we know what's going on here. And the number of chemicals, there were 11 boxes of chemicals. So I met them 2 hours before the safety meeting and we started evaluating. And what we found, the very first container that I picked up was a container of thermite. Thermite is an extremely strong oxidizer, likes to light itself. It's actually kind of hard to get lit on fire. But once you light that stuff on fire, it will burn through concrete. And it eats through its containers regularly, so it likes to leak all over boxes. And so then we end up with an oxidizer sitting on an unstable, really old oxidizer sitting on cardboard, which is a really nice combustible source for it. We found chemicals that were commingled together. Oxidizers were in with toxins. We had hydroxides in with flammables. We had leaking containers. We had contamination on the interior of the box. You can see the blue chunkies, probably cupric sulfate, I'm guessing, which is not, a fairly benign chemical, but it's not something you want to mess with. And it's not something that you want to have just floating around in an empty box. And as I was looking through the boxes, one of the things we found is this box, the center photo there was actually the box on the lower level. So it had stuff stacked on top of it. And as I'm very slowly moving chemicals away, I noticed these 3 uniquely shaped bottles, 2 of which are very rusted, 1 of which is still in a plastic container. So the strategy there when we see things like that is to gently move everything else out of the box so that we can clearly see what we're dealing with. And what we ended up with was 3 containers of sodium peroxide. Again, super strong oxidizer, likes to light itself on fire, likes to light other things on fire. Most of the time with sodium peroxide, one of the big problems is we lift up the container, the bottom falls out of it. And then of course we've got sodium peroxide sitting on combustible material, which likes to light on fire. It's just a really bad combination all around. And these were old enough that I pulled the safety data sheet and provided it to the school district and said, take a look at the safety data sheet. This has a list of like 27 items that it cross-reacts with. In addition to that, it's actually classified as a shock-sensitive, friction-sensitive, water-reactive, flammable oxidizer. This is not something to mess with. I reached out, did a couple of phone a friends, and we've segregated these 3 containers. And now the school district has decided, wow, we probably should look at every school to see what we've got. And we will eventually bring in a high hazard team to stabilize and ship these 3 containers for disposal. The other 162 containers had a variety of different types of chemicals in them. So as I was evaluating them, I sorted them by chemical class. And then it was under 220 pounds of material. So we were able to use our local household hazardous waste facility for disposal of most of the chemicals. We were also able to sort through, and one of the other crazy things that I see all the time when I'm doing this is we see things that are non-hazardous and can go in the garbage mixed right in with the highly hazardous stuff. We had a number of containers of buffers that had a pH of 7 for evaluating your pH meter, for calibrating pH meters. So those, I said, okay, there's no reason that these can't go down the drain. So we poured those out. And overall, we probably saved the school district, I would guess, probably $300 by removing the non-hazardous chemicals that were present. It's about 15 minutes after we got everything sorted and secured, we went over to present at the, I went over to present at the district safety meeting. And the lead science teacher was at the district safety meeting. And so I said, I'd like to have a conversation with you after this because there were quite a few things that were missing. And one of the things that I've learned over the years is that there are certain classes of chemicals that the science teachers will also recognize, wow, this is scary stuff. I probably shouldn't move it and put it in the box. And the other thing that was missing were a lot of solvents. So we got through the safety meeting and I talked to the science teacher and I said, now, do you have any alkaline earth metals? Because based on what I saw, I found a lot of legacy chemicals. And I'm guessing that you do. And he said, well, yeah, we've got some. I just didn't put them in the box. I said, okay, we'll take a look at those. And then over the next few slides this morning, we're going to go through what the specific chemical classes that are high risk are that we commonly see so that you can go back to your stock rooms and just with your eyes, please don't be moving things around. Just with your eyes, evaluate whether or not you have any of these legacy chemicals or highly dangerous chemicals. So do you have them? The goal is we've got to keep my primary goal anytime I'm teaching this is to keep teachers safe while they're evaluating for legacy chemicals. When I'm working specifically with schools to help them inventory and identify what they want to get rid of, there are 4 primary criteria that we really focus on. And I've used this for a very long time and it works really well. The very first step that we do is I ask the teachers, instead of what do you want to get rid of, we focus on what are you using? What's in your curriculum? Now, I come from a whole family of teachers. I've got sisters, my daughter's a teacher, my parents were teachers, my brother's a principal. So there's a lot of us, and this is the kind of stuff we sit around talking about. But I've asked them, do you have to, as teachers, stick with just the curriculum? And it's really funny. It's almost a district by district answer. And most of the time the answer is, well, if you see a really cool thing, the teachers can bring it in. We trust their professional skill and knowledge to identify what's too risky for the classroom. So we have seen lots of TikTok experiments popping up over the last few years. I'm going to let you know, just because it looks safe on TikTok doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work the same way in your classroom. So if there's big flames involved, if there's acutely toxic, most of those aren't acutely toxic. Most of them just like to make big booms and big flames. Please take into consideration that a lot of those videos are not representative of the 50 other times that they did that experiment and things went sideways. So you can actually Google out on YouTube, science experiment mishaps, and there's all kinds of fodder out there. The 4 so we start off with asking teachers, what are you currently using? All right, and then once we get through that, what is required from curriculum, then we ask, okay, is there anything else that you're bringing in that you like just because it's a cool experiment? Let's talk about those. And then we'll help evaluate whether or not we've got the appropriate safety measures and environment in place to be able to do those to be able to do those experiments. But there has to be some discussion about that. As we're going through and evaluating inventories, the 4 questions that we focus on are the 4 aspects that we focus on. First one is age. Chemicals really are not designed by manufacturers to sit around for more than, I'd say, 5 to 10 years. So if you've got a container that's left over from 1955, you cannot rely on the integrity of that chemical. And it may be some nice solid salt that's been sitting around that you go and you look at and you go, it's stable, nothing's really happened to it. You have no idea what has happened over the last 70 years. If there's been any cross-contamination, if it's been subjected to high heat, if it's been frozen, if there are so many questions that you don't know the answer to, that I'm going to really push hard and say, you know what, if it's more than 10 years old, even if it's a nice stable salt, if you're still using it, it's time for you to replace it and get a fresh chemical that you know is going to work and behave correctly, or as you anticipate it should behave. The next thing we look at is container integrity. If we have broken lids, if we have chemicals with crystals on the exterior of lids, if the chemicals have eaten their way out of the container, we don't keep those chemicals. Third, we look at the quantity of chemicals that you have. I've been in numerous schools where I've had conversations with science teachers and they've said, well, you know, I do this experiment and I need 50 grams a year. Okay, 50 grams a year. So over 5 years, you need 250 grams. That's about, you know, if you keep one 500-gram container, you're set for 10 years. You have 34 500-gram containers. We need to parse this down a little bit. And so I'm going to encourage you to minimize your risk by minimizing your quantities to only what you're going to use over the next 5 years. Keep yourself a little 20% buffer, you know, whatever makes you feel safe, that's fine, but 5 years. And then the last criteria is the danger level. We're currently working on finishing up we have a spreadsheet inventory of about 1,000 chemicals. And this is a gift from Dave Waddell. Dave Waddell worked with one of the leading national science teachers and identified the top 995 chemicals that are commonly found in schools and universities. Went through, built a spreadsheet that lists the physical, chemical, and environmental hazards, and also correlated that to what age students is it acceptable to be using this chemical around. And there are some of the chemicals that are listed on there that fall under what's called a forbidden category. An example, sodium cyanide. Really no reason to have a pound of sodium cyanide in your chemical stockroom. Thiocyanates, maybe. Ferrocyanides, maybe. Those are more stable sodium salts, but sodium cyanide, wickedly dangerous. Off-gas is cyanide gas under the right conditions, not something that's needed in schools. And I've yet to find any curriculum where sodium cyanide is used. Nobody's been able to show me. So I think I just threw down the gauntlet, Vicky. We might see an experiment that comes in with sodium cyanide. I'd sure like to know. I don't see that there's any value to having that in schools. We're finishing that up by adding in GHS pictograms and adding in CAS numbers and evaluating those chemicals. We're also building now a database of safety data sheets. And it's my goal over the next 6 months or so to finish that list so that we can send it out to schools with that collection of safety data sheets. And the safety data sheets that we're collecting are predominantly from Sigma. So they're good quality, very understandable and complete safety data sheets. Those are the 4 criteria: the age, the container integrity, the quantity that's present, and the danger level. And that's what we work towards every time we're evaluating a chemical inventory. We want to work with administrators so that when we do this and we go through this process with schools, that they understand, you know, if we're using cupric sulfate and the container that we have is from 1970, it's probably time to replace that container so that we have a known chemical that is refreshed, that is fresh, that is non-contaminated, and behaves in our experiments the way that we anticipate and expect it to behave. So we need to have that buy-in that we may be getting rid of some things and then asking to replace them. When we replace them, we need to replace them in quantities that are quantity appropriate, less than 5 years or less in quantity. One of the other things that I've found over the years is that teachers, particularly science teachers, have a very emotional attachment to chemical containers. And that's one thing that we've had to really work on. Helping teachers to understand that it's okay to get rid of these chemicals. Teachers are so focused on not wasting anything because resources are so tight that it becomes very hard to get rid of, dispose of all of those chemicals that meet those 4 criteria. So we talk a lot about that. We work through it, and we identify strategies that, make it easier to actually get rid of those chemicals. Predominantly, we ask things like, well, are you using this? And I can't tell you the number of containers that I found over the years that have those labels from the 1950s and 60s and still have the plastic ring around the lid indicating they've never even been opened. I'm getting kind of old and crusty in my old age. And so if I'm finding any chemicals that are older than me right now, they really need to go. So that's one of the other talking points that we have. The other piece of this is we want to make sure that everyone understands that this is not an emergency. These chemicals have quietly been sitting, eating their way out of their own containers for 50, 75 years, and nothing has happened. Okay. Well, I shouldn't say nothing. We had the Andale School fire. But the vast majority of them, this is when we discover these, this is not a situation where we have to shut down the school, evacuate everybody, call 911 and get the emergency response parade. It's just not, there are ways that we can mitigate these risks and handle this in a methodical, calm response. So again, this is not an emergency. We just need to get it taken care of. So please take a look at the webinars from last year that discussed in detail some of the risks that we see and how to mitigate those. Over the next few slides, we're going to talk about chemicals that are high hazard. These are the ones that concern me most, particularly when I get a phone call that says, hey, my science teachers piled a bunch of stuff in boxes and they decided they wanted to get rid of it. You need to be aware of these chemicals so that you can avoid picking them up and moving them around. Key classifications of concern are peroxide formers. So, and if you Google any of these terms, you will get all kinds of exceptional resources. And in fact, our university systems have been very good at identifying and creating lists of peroxide formers and giving us guidance on how dangerous they are. Picric acid, we don't see a whole lot of that, but we do see it. And typically picric acid is hidden. It has been used in the past as a stain. So it's in with all of our benign stains and dyes. So that's probably the thing that makes it the most scary, is we can come across a dry bottle of picric acid mixed in with phenolphthalein and litmus. It's scary stuff. Metallic potassium, metallic sodium, we'll talk a little more about that. Nitro compounds. I have some slides to show you some of those, and then peroxides. Water and air reactives, we see white and yellow phosphorus occasionally. We do see red phosphorus. It's not nearly as dangerous as white and yellow phosphorus. That's the one that likes to light itself on fire if you drop it and it's exposed to air, and then it off gases phosphoric acid gas and phosphine and some other crazy things. Earth metals, lithium, potassium, sodium. Containers with integrity risk, crystals on the outside, broken caps. We do occasionally see DEA controlled substances. These are typically in biology and they're really old. Nobody knows what to do with them. I will let you know, that one's a really tricky one. We're going to have to work with regulators to get rid of that. And then radioactives, typically we find those in physics, and they're in physics and they're usually not secured and they're usually emitting radiation when we find them. And they've been used to make the Geiger counter click. So I think we have some better options for making our Geiger counters click. So these are the peroxide formers, key points with peroxide formers. Typically, storage on peroxide formers is recommended at no more than about 18 months. And typically now they come with inhibitors. We have found lots of ether that is way more than 18 months old. And if we find any of these peroxide formers, they can't be shipped. They have to be stabilized. The other challenge with with ether in particular is it likes to seep out under the ring of the lid, and that's where those peroxide crystals can form. So you can't see where they are. So if you decide that you want to open one of those containers, you disrupt those crystals. Extremely exothermic, very dangerous reaction. Likes to blow the container apart, create a lot of shrapnel. Big fireball. These are bomb squad candidates. Now, again, these are not 911s. These are leave on the shelf, don't touch them. And one of the things I want you to look at in particular, in that little center photo, you'll see the weird little, very rusty container with the funky little cap on it. That's actually a hunk of lead. One time ether was sent out with lead caps. And the thought process was, well, the lead is malleable enough, we can shove it down in there and then it won't allow oxygen to come in. The problem is when you take the lead cap off, the oxygen comes in. And then we, of course, can end up with peroxide crystals. Most common that we see is ethyl ether. We also see cyclohexene, tetrahydrofuran, styrene, acetaldehyde, metallic potassium, and this is a new one for me in the last 5 years, isopropanol. And I would never have believed that, yep, common isopropanol. Now, typically the isopropanol that we run into problems with has a concentration of greater than 70%. Okay, if it's greater than 70%, and it's been sitting around for a long time and exposed to a lot of air, we do have the potential for peroxide formation. And I never would have believed that, but I found it 2 different times in 2 different industries in the last 5 years. So again, requires stabilization in order for us to be able to ship it. Other peroxide formers, dioxanes, those are pretty rare, but we do see them. And then cyclohexene and acetaldehyde again. Acetaldehyde is pretty common one too. These are chemicals that are very unpredictable when they're dry. And you can see on the left, we've got sodium peroxide, very unpredictable, shock sensitive, reacts with a lot of things, likes to light itself on fire, likes to blow up. It's a bad deal. Dinitrophenol, typically those are in really small little containers, but still very dangerous. And then on the right there, you see tetrahydrofuran, colloidine. A lot of times when we find colloidine, and I want you to notice there in that colloidine bottle that it has a 1960s Mallinckrodt label, and look, the plastic on the top has never been removed. So this chemical's been sitting around since 1960 and it's never been opened. When we found that colloidine, it had hockey pucked into the bottom. So the solvent had dissipated off over the years, and we end up with this nitrocellulose puck in the bottom of the bottle that is extremely dangerous. So let's see, nitro organics, picric acid, these are some of the things. Bouin's fluid is one that we see quite a bit. It's made with picric acid, something to be aware of. Nobody really uses it anymore, but a lot of fake places have it. And that picric acid, again, it's another one that'll off gas. That picric acid will form crystals and dry and becomes very shock sensitive at that point. Nitroanilins, dinitrotoluene, those are pretty common in biology. Now, the earth metals, this is kind of interesting because one of the things that I've seen numerous times is we'll have teachers that have metallic sodium, metallic potassium. Metallic sodium and potassium are water reactive, so they are stored under oil. If they're older than about 19, I would say 65, 1970, occasionally metallic sodium was alkaline metal metallic sodium was shipped dry. It in large quantities in industry, it is still shipped dry. Frankly, living in Iowa with the humidity levels that we have, that's just terrifying to me. I think that's crazy. So stored under oil, and when you look at it, it needs to be that shiny gray color with no orange, no red. Okay? If you are continuing to use metallic sodium and you're plucking it up out of the oil and it's got orange fuzziness on it or yellow fuzziness on it or black, potassium turns black when it oxidizes, Those are superoxides. They can become, they're highly reactive. They're unstable. They're potentially explosive. By the time they get to red orange, they're really, really unstable. At that point, we've generated ozonide, funky, crazy chemical reaction. And it's that oxygen reacting with the surface of those metals every time you take it out of the container. So those are very, very dangerous, and we need to make sure that we handle those correctly. And those are ones you shouldn't be using. Do not just, I had a teacher one time, well, I just scrape off the orange stuff and then there's good stuff underneath it. Okay, the scraping off of the orange stuff is the really high risk point. So I'm really grateful that you still have all your fingers. Okay, next one, phosphorus. I don't know why we do this. Phosphorus is air reactive and we always store it in glass jars. A lot of times it's in old glass peanut butter or pickle jars. I have no idea why, but that's how we store it. We drop one of those jars and not only does it burn through the floor, but then it's going to off gas phosphorus pentoxide, hydrofluoric acid gas, or phosphoric acid gas, wicked bad stuff. So these are not things that we want to have in the classroom. Potassium cyanide, sodium cyanide, and sodium azide. Sodium azide is a unique one. It's acutely toxic, and then it's also, if it's contaminated with any type of metal, can become explosive. We actually had an incident, oh gosh, probably 20, 25 years ago, where we had a hazardous waste worker killed because of sodium azide explosion. Acute metals and bioaccumulative toxins. We see a lot of toxic metals. Arsenates, lead chemicals, chromates, all of these, antimony, mercury, mercuric nitrate, those types of things. The antimony is not, but the majority of these are heavily regulated by EPA or by your local solid waste agency. These are things that we cannot put down the drain or into the trash. So we need to collect these and manage them as hazardous waste if we're going to use them in experiments. And that's one of the things that I rarely see. I'll find an entire collection of chemicals that are being used in a chemical stockroom and no waste collection containers. Do you know what it means when I find that there are no waste collection containers? It means it's all either going down the drain, up the hood, or in the trash. And all of those are violations of our EPA or state environmental regulatory requirements. We see more acute toxins. Mercury fulminate is a bad one. We don't see that real often. And then we see a lot of unknowns. Things where containers have had labels eaten off of them. They've got weird crystallization. They've eaten through their shelves. Those instances are pretty common with legacy chemicals. Here's another kind of collection of photos over the years. So I've been doing this way too long. I have the greatest collection of creepy chemical photos anywhere. All right, container integrity concerns, and we've seen this at multiple states. Anytime we have this container crystallization on the exterior, everybody always thinks immediately, oh my gosh, those are the explosives. Peroxide crystals, typically, I haven't seen a lot of peroxide crystals on the exterior. They form under the caps, they form floating in solution, but I don't usually see those on the exterior. The thing that concerns me on the exterior contamination is the exposure when those crystals decide to take off and float through the air. So if I'm cleaning out a school and I see something like this, number one, I'm going to make sure I have respiratory protection on. And that's really hard to decipher what respiratory protection you have because you're running into so many different chemical classes that to constantly work in an APR, an air purifying respirator it's kind of a guessing game. What are you going to run into? I keep a lot of zip close bags with me. And if I find something that has contamination on the exterior of it, I'll open one of the zip closed bags before I really look at it and set it gently over the top just so that I'm not inhaling or any of those crystals, and those crystals are not hitting my skin or my mucous membranes in my eyes. So lots of personal protective equipment. The one on the left was particularly disconcerting. We've got arsenic trichloride there. Arsenic trichloride, it's a real weird chemical. Not a whole lot of folks use it, and it has an OSHA permissible exposure limit of 0.01 parts per million. Those were super fluffy crystals. That one actually just sat there until the hazardous waste company came, and the guys in their full PPE were able to cover it and remove it safely. But fluffy crystals, if we disrupted that, they aerosolize, they float through the air, we breathe them in, bad things will happen, especially with an OSHA permissible exposure limit of 0.01 parts per million. Crazy low. In biology, we see things like, nobody knows why these are here. They haven't been used since the 1970s. Chloral hydrate, it's one of the main components for making Mickeys. Right next to this chloral hydrate, to the right of it, you'll see a small lead pig that had a radioactive source in it. I had a teacher that kept Thorazine, injectable Thorazine, in one of her desk drawers. She said, "Oh, I don't really have a use for it. I just threaten my students with it occasionally." I thought, wow, we should probably move you to a different occupation. That's a little scary. We see a lot of things like old adrenaline, old testosterone, like we need more testosterone in schools. And then we have things like Geiger or anything that's radioactive that makes the Geiger counters click. And we've seen a lot of these throughout the years. These are really tough to get rid of, but we have some mechanisms and some agency support. With agency support in Iowa, we've been able to get rid of a lot of things. And again, if they were secured sources that were designed to make the Geiger counter click, and we had them that we could lock them down and secure them, maybe I could see keeping a source or two, but some of these things are just that they're emitting all the time. And, the last thing we want to do is expose people. So if we have legacy chemicals, so if you have this problem in your stockroom, and other teachers other than science teachers, I promise we're getting to your stuff next. But if you have legacy chemicals, please do not just immediately start moving things around. You have got to build some education and understanding of what some of the things on the shelf, what level of risk they could present to you. We know that disposal through a hazardous waste company is complicated, it's expensive, it takes a lot of regulatory understanding to get it right. A lot of hazardous waste companies will offer you some support there. But I have experienced over the years where hazardous waste companies have kind of taken advantage of that, and they've charged schools for disposal of non-hazardous items too. So it's really critical for you to make sure that you're getting some education for yourself before you just go in and start boxing things up to get rid of them. We want to evaluate what your current use is, and ideally we'll do current use and then keep an extra maybe 20%. But anything that's too dangerous, we need to get rid of. All right. Typical sources of school hazardous waste in other areas other than sciences. Sciences, of course, but in art, we also see things like paints and paint thinners, spray adhesives, spray paint. We see toxic metals in powdered glazes and ceramics materials. In career and technical education, we see woodworking stains and chemicals, paints, automotive chemicals. A lot of these things also become outdated. They don't necessarily meet the criteria for legacy chemicals, but they usually meet the criteria of, we probably should minimize our risk by getting rid of this stuff and only concentrating on the things that we actually use and need for our curriculum. Facilities, we see a lot of, every time we do a change in cleaning chemicals, we see a leftover pile of cleaning chemicals that typically can be very expensive to dispose of. Bus barns is another location where we find stuff. This is just a rough overview. And the challenge is that all of these different departments and areas of the school typically operate autonomously. So you kind of operate just within your district. That's a really big challenge because regulators look at your whole facility. So you're not regulated if the science department does its own clean out and the CTE department does its own clean out and the custodians do their own clean out, you're regulated by the whole school. And if we don't know what certain quantities we can dispose of, we can put ourselves into what's called a large quantity generator status very easily. And we move from having to comply with roughly 15 regulations as a very small quantity generator up to about 150 different regulations. Everything from preparedness to safety measures. So there are a lot of ramifications if we just do this one-time big giant clean out and we don't have any regulatory guidance. Those are some things that we're going to talk about in the next few webinars. Understanding what you have is also a requirement of the law, and inventory is a requirement. So we're going to talk about how best we can make an inventory. Other challenges that schools face that we don't usually see in inventory, we've had a lot of school turnover. We've had a lot of change in curriculum. Every time we have those changes, we have leftover abandoned chemicals behind. And in fact, I'm on my second generation now of teachers in a lot of the schools that I helped clean out in the early 2000s. I have still continued to find very few waste collection containers. That's really concerning to me. Many other areas of the schools, regulators refer to chemical waste as waste generation. And schools or any generators are regulated based on the amount in a calendar month that is identified as waste. And so we have some strategies over the years that we've developed to help make sure that we're staying within those thresholds and we make slow, steady progress in removing and disposing excess chemicals that are no longer wanted. Again, this is really challenging for teachers. Teachers have a really hard time throwing away things that they might need. And so we have to have some discussion and some education around that. The other problem is we have no clear owners of these chemicals, especially when we have a teacher change or a curriculum change, and there's no purchasing procedures that are in place. All of these different things present unique challenges with schools. When we work to focus on understanding these regulatory requirements, what that allows us is a framework for how to build standard operating procedures and a full chemical hygiene and lab safety plan. And that's what I'm going to call it. The word chemical hygiene plan gets confusing. People wonder why we call it a hygiene plan. And so I usually refer to those as chemical hygiene, which is the code requirement, and lab safety plan. And we put that together in a contiguous plan at the district level. And that way we've got a clear understanding across the district of what is allowed, how we purchase things, and how we button up and dispose of things, how we collect what's required for regulation for us to collect. In conjunction with that, we also look at the safety requirements. We conduct, in OSHA terms, it's called a job hazard analysis. I'm going to call it a general hazard analysis. Once we identify general hazards associated with working with particular chemicals, we can then identify personal protective equipment, respiratory protection, and engineering controls that we have to have in place in order to be able to work with these chemicals safely. The regulators that schools fall under are vast, and I'm sure all of you that are in schools know this. The interesting thing was when I got finished conducting the safety meeting or participating in the district safety meeting last week, and I talked with the science teacher and also with one of the nurses in the district. They both said, you know, we've got a procedure in place for everything. We have rules all over the place of how we're supposed to do things, except for chemical waste management. And it's because it's really complicated. So some of the regulators, we have OSHA that regulates and watches out for worker safety. OSHA is the federal agency. We have many states that have their own OSHA program, or they have different departments. In New Hampshire, for example, we see a lot of OSHA influence from Department of Labor, and they have some specific rules that are fairly new, and we'll be talking about those in depth for what kind of documentation is required in schools as far as the chemical hygiene lab safety plan, as well as things like storage of acids, storage of flammables, and just some general safety measures that need to be in place. We see EPA from the environmental side. EPA is the federal agency. In many states, in fact, in every state in the contiguous US, we have a state agency that's responsible for hazardous waste and solid waste management, except for Iowa. And Iowa will report directly to EPA. But every other state in the US has a state department that oversees hazardous waste management, solid waste management, recycling, those types of things. And then we have Department of Public Safety and local fire departments. Fire codes also have some influence here, and then Department of Education. Department of Education is more focused on curriculum guidance and standards testing and meeting standards. So we need to take their information of what's going to be used and then look at that from the regulatory and safety perspectives. The interesting thing is we still, not that I have found, we still have no student chemical protection standards. We have no reporting when students are injured. It's a really interesting situation. All right. We cannot evaluate all regulations that impact schools from all agencies. So we're going to hit the big ones. Okay, we're going to hit the most impactful ones. We just don't have enough time. First thing that I'm going to encourage you to do, and we're going to talk about this in the next webinar, is you're going to need to build a strong coalition of support. So this is not a one-person job in a school district. This is a lot of people working together. Different departments will need to be represented, and your facilities and maintenance folks will need to be represented. One of the biggest challenges we see is just like what I ran into last week. Science teachers pile a bunch of stuff in boxes, they take it down. No indication of risk, no evaluation for chemical characterization and chemical compatibilities. And they simply put a work order on it and say, dispose of this. You're going to need to identify a champion for your district that becomes your chemical hygiene officer. And that's a requirement of the OSHA laboratory standard. In fact, I would encourage you to take a look at that. It's in 29 CFR Code of Federal Regulations, and it's in 1910.1450. And if you have any questions about that, send that over to me and I'll make sure that you know where to look and review that. We want to work towards implementing a chemical hygiene safety plan, building a robust inventory and safety data sheets for the building, and building some standard operating procedures so that you know how to manage your building and we button up all of those waste management questions. We'll go through some best practices as well and some strategies that I found successful over the years. Collaboration within the district and within your school is critical. This is going to take a team effort. The regulations are typically written at the building level. So if we have different departments acting autonomously, it can create some really big regulatory challenges for the school district. Coordination is going to be key. So the next time we're going to talk about coordination and committee help, collaboration together. And then in your final demonstration of competency, so these are the same 3 questions that I asked you at the beginning. Legacy chemicals are rarely found in schools. Is that true or false? Unfortunately, that's false. We see them all over the place. If a school has not participated in a targeted legacy chemical cleanout, it's likely those chemicals are still present. Hazardous chemicals are only found in science rooms. Is that true or false? Also false. We see a lot of chemicals throughout the buildings. The vast majority of dangerous ones are in science labs, but we see legacy chemicals all over the place. OSHA is the only agency that regulates hazardous chemical management. No, also false. School chemical risk mitigation and school safe chemical chemical management in schools is regulated by a number of different agencies. All right, steps that you can take today. I covered a lot of stuff. If you have questions, and I did have 3 questions come in prior to during registration, so I'll answer those in just a minute. I covered a lot of stuff today. I know I hit you with a lot of information. I've had a number of teachers that have found it helpful to listen to these webinars a couple of times because they are packed with so much information. Please feel free to do that. The first step you can take is to begin identifying for your district and for your school who is going to be on this team that's going to tackle this, who's going to be the owner of it and the champion. And that person will need to be a chemical hygiene officer. I get a lot of questions about, do you have to have really, really strong science background? Does it always have to be the science teacher? Absolutely not. What we need is somebody that's diligent, that's willing to work with a lot of people, and that's willing to learn some things. And I'm not going to teach you to be a chemist overnight. It's not going to happen. But we have some guidelines and we have some general information that will help you with that. This person will need to, and this team will need to coordinate with departments, facilities, as well as administration. And in the upcoming webinars, we're going to discuss how to write that chemical hygiene lab safety plan, the associated standard operating procedures, and then the easiest and best ways to conduct an inventory so that you can identify what needs to go away. We're going to discuss those resources. And again, I would encourage you to take a look at webinars from last year so that you can get more in-depth information about risk mitigation. That was the focus last year. Our next webinar is March 24th, and I really hope that you're able to tune in and join us. Okay, questions that came up. I have one question about safety data sheets. How do we know what safety data sheets to collect? And it's not as complicated as you would think. The first thing is I would encourage you to take a look at the safety data sheet requirement, which is it's under in federal regulations. Okay, so your state may have additional regulations at the state level, but under federal regulations, this is called the Hazard Communication Plan, HAZCOM, and it's in 29 CFR 1910-1200. That's the section of code that dictates this. Now, rule of thumb, rough and dirty, how do I know if I need to keep a safety data sheet? If I can buy the product that I'm looking at, so I go through my inventory, if I lift up the chemical and I look at it and it's something that I can purchase at a box store or a grocery store, it's considered to be a consumer product. OSHA does not require us to have safety data sheets for consumer products. That would include things like food, okay? Now, what OSHA does require us to have safety data sheets for are what are considered commercial products. Frequently, these are things that are at higher concentrations, more dangerous. Sometimes they're just unique chemical profiles. We can't usually buy them at a box store. We can't buy them at a grocery store. Okay, so if these are specialty chemicals, we want to have a safety data sheet. And if you're confused by that, or I want you to err on the side of caution. If you think, if you've got that nagging feeling of, I might need a safety, just pull one down. They're available all over the place. Pull down a safety data sheet. Does it have to be the exact one, the most recent from the manufacturer? Technically, there's a lot of information in that section of code that addresses that. I'm going to tell you from a working perspective, if you have a good quality safety data sheet that gives you information, that's the one that I would keep. I would try to get the most recent for the manufacturer that I have, but my focus would be practical application. I want one that's going to be most pertinent to be able to convey risk should I have an exposure problem. The second question, Vicky, I'm drawing a blank now. We had a question about safety data sheets. We had a question about, do you remember what those were? I don't remember the other ones.
About charter schools was one.
Oh, charter schools are still, yeah, these are state and federal regulations. So all schools are subject to this. And the interesting thing is most of the safety regulations are focused on employee safety. That's a whole section of code and regulations. And then we have environmental protection, and that's targeted at specific chemicals and how they need to be managed. Oh, that was one of the questions was, are you going to be able to go through and tell us exactly what we can throw away? I am not going to be able to do that. And the reason, the regulations at the federal level can vary slightly with the regulations at the state level. So to go through every single chemical and see if it applies in your state can be, it's there, we just don't have enough time. One of the examples that I want to give you, and we also have to make some judgment calls, and that's where best practices come in. Under EPA regulations, okay, so not state environmental regulations, EPA federal regulations. There are some surprising chemicals that we wouldn't normally anticipate. Things like barium chemicals and selenium chemicals. Those are ones that will show up in like multivitamins. So if you have an experiment that's using multivitamins, before you just throw those in the trash, you really need to take a look at what the concentration, if they have selenium is in them. That would be one example. Another one would be like cupric sulfate. Cupric sulfate is not regulated by EPA. However, it is regulated frequently by a number of the local wastewater treatment plants. So each chemical uniquely could fall under that. Now, there are, of course, some chemicals that are really completely benign, things like calcium carbonate, okay, or baking soda is another one that I frequently see. Okay, both of those would be ones that we could throw away. But we really need to develop that inventory and then go chemical by chemical, evaluate chemical by chemical. There are some high level kind of rules that I can give you that prohibit environmental disposal of different chemicals, but it's pretty unfortunately the regulations are pretty complicated. If you have a specific chemical that you're interested in, you're welcome to email it to me and I can tell you whether or not, you know, in the location that you're in, whether or not you need to manage that as a hazardous waste or not. All right, do we have any other questions for today? We've got just a few minutes left. And Vicky, I can't see any other questions. So if anything comes in,
I will let you know that there were a couple comments. Christina McKean said, I'm fairly sure the SDS exemption is limited to if the product is used the same way and with the same frequency as normal consumer use. So if it is used in chemistry, even if it's cornstarch, it needs an SDS. And then
okay.
Andrew Shearer says, in Vermont, Drew Youngs at DEC can help schools determine what is dangerous and offer guidance.
Excellent.
And you do have another question. I don't think you answered this. You answered most of them, I think. So the question was, from the perspective of disposal of any chemicals and or PPE and products used to clean up in any mishaps, assuming none should go into the regular garbage?
That's correct. I'm gonna encourage you to use a best practice with that. So if we have a spill that we have to clean up that involves chemicals, and we use gloves, and you know maybe we have a lab apron that gets splashed on or anything like that, those do need to be collected as a best practice and managed as hazardous waste. Of course, if we're using something like a sodium chloride salt solution, different story, completely benign. There are no environmental regulations for managing that. It is not on any of the environmental regulatory lists, U list, P list, K list, any of those. So that could, in a situation like that, the personal protective equipment and the cleanup materials could go in the trash. But I'm going to encourage you, I'm going to really strongly encourage you that if there is any question whatsoever, to avoid violating any of these regulations, collect the materials, put it in a 5-gallon bucket, and dispose of it as you dispose of your hazardous waste. And we will talk about options. Disposing of hazardous waste from schools is really tough. In some states, you can partner with your HHW, your household hazardous waste collection facilities, or household hazardous waste collection days. In other states, that's completely prohibited. So I'll try to give good information specifically for Vermont, New Hampshire, because I know most folks most folks attending the webinars are from those states. But I'm going to tell you, this is complex stuff. It's just not easy. This is why there is not a procedure in place, because it's not a simple answer. Probably the simplest answer is, you walk away from your chemical storage area, you call your local hazardous waste vendor and ask them to come in and get rid of anything that's legacy or anything you're not using. And they just haul everything away. But there are all kinds of documentation, paperwork, registration for EPA identification numbers. There's a lot of steps to take for that. Okay, do we have any other questions? Okay. Hey, thank you all so much for the time today. I truly appreciate it. Please take a look at the at last year's webinars before you go moving any chemicals around. And then hopefully I'll see you in the next couple of weeks and we'll start moving through how do we meet all of these really tough and challenging regulatory requirements. What are some strategies that we can do and who's the team that we need to put together. So thank you so much. Appreciate your time today. Take care.